There is smoke over the Strait of Hormuz. And I want you to stop, not to feel fear, not to check your portfolio, not to scroll through headlines looking for reassurance, but to understand what you are actually witnessing. Because what the cameras are showing you is not a war. What the anchors are describing is not a conflict. What the politicians are framing as a crisis of national security is, in the deepest philosophical and historical sense, something else entirely. What you are watching is the timer's great transition. And if you do not have the conceptual architecture to interpret this moment correctly, you will make every wrong financial decision that legacy institutions and failing governments are counting on you to make. You will panic. You will cling to the structures that are dissolving in front of your eyes and wonder why your wealth is dissolving with them. Welcome to Vested Network. Subscribe right now, not because of what we say, but because of how we say it. We do not give you news. We give you the map the news is trying to hide. Every week, we translate the raw chaos of geopolitical reality into the only language that matters: sovereign capital, protected wealth, and financial apostasy from the dying systems of the industrial age. Subscribe. This conversation will cost you nothing and could preserve everything. In 1997, Davidson and Rees-Mogg published The Sovereign Individual. It was dismissed as fringe thinking. 29 years later, every structural prediction in that book is unfolding with the precision of a mathematical proof. Their argument was radical at the time. The nation-state is not permanent. It is not the natural end state of human organization. It is a technology, a specific response to specific conditions, the concentration of violence, the monopoly over money, and the geographic capture of productive populations who had no means of exit. The nation-state thrived because it could do two things no private entity could match: project overwhelming violence at scale, and issue the currency through which all economic activity was forced to flow. These twin monopolies, violence and money, were the pillars holding up taxation, regulation, borders, and the relentless extraction of wealth from those who created it toward those who controlled the political machinery. But those monopolies are collapsing, not because of ideology, not because libertarians won an argument, but because of technology. When the cost of projecting violence falls below the cost of defending against it, the nation-state loses its primary justification. When cryptographic technology severs the link between economic activity and geographic jurisdiction, the nation-state loses its revenue model. What we are watching in the Strait of Hormuz is a nation-state Iran, threatening to weaponize the last great choke point of the industrial age energy system against the most powerful nation-state on Earth, the United States, which is fighting not just a military battle but a monetary one, the defense of the petrodollar, the most sophisticated monopoly on money ever constructed in the history of human civilization. This is not a war between America and Iran. This is the last great convulsion of the industrial era, fighting to preserve itself against the rising tide of the cyber age. In 1971, Nixon ended the convertibility of the dollar to gold. This was the single most consequential financial decision of the 20th century. It removed the last physical constraint on dollar creation and created an existential problem. If the dollar was no longer backed by gold, what gave it value? The answer, negotiated secretly with Saudi Arabia in 1974, was oil. Under the Petrodollar Agreement, OPEC priced oil exclusively in US dollars. Every nation on Earth that needed oil, which was every nation on Earth, needed dollars. The demand for dollars was permanently and artificially elevated, allowing the United States to run deficits that would have destroyed any other currency, export inflation to the global south, and maintain hegemony not through productivity alone, but through monetary capture. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a waterway. It is the physical throat of the petrodollar system. Approximately 20% of all globally traded oil passes through that channel. Iranian threats to close the strait are not merely military gestures. They are existential threats to the monetary architecture upon which the entire Western financial order rests. And here is the dark irony that Davidson and Rees-Mogg would recognize immediately. The very act of defending that choke point accelerates the process the United States is trying to prevent. Every missile fired, every sanction weaponized, every barrel priced outside the dollar is a crack in the dam. China is watching. The global South, which has spent 70 years subsidizing American monetary supremacy, is watching. The mathematical certainty is this: when the cost of enforcing a monopoly exceeds the revenue it generates, the monopoly ends. The United States is burning trillions to maintain a military posture in the Persian Gulf that generates no productivity, no innovation, no competitive advantage in the emerging cyber economy. It is burning the seed corn of the future to protect the harvest of the past. Let us now speak with precision, because precision is what separates the philosophically equipped investor from the noise-driven speculator. Davidson and Rees-Mogg described a structural law of wealth migration that operates across every major civilizational transition in history. When the technological conditions that made one form of organization dominant begin to erode, capital does not wait for political permission to move. Capital is coagulated intelligence. It flows toward protection and productivity, with the same amoral consistency that water flows downhill. In the transition from the agricultural age to the industrial age, wealth migrated from land to machines, factories, and urban productive infrastructure. The landed aristocracy resisted through every political mechanism available: corn laws, feudal restrictions. The American Civil War, at its root, an economic conflict between an agrarian South and an industrializing North. The resistance was fierce. The resistance was ultimately irrelevant. Capital migrated anyway because the mathematical logic of the new technology was irresistible. We are now in the middle of an equivalent transition from the industrial age to the cyber age, and the Iran-US conflict is not slowing that migration. It is catalyzing it. Every day the Strait of Hormuz remains a military flashpoint. Three things happen simultaneously. First, energy price volatility increases, structurally incompatible with the industrial age financial system that requires predictable costs to maintain its illusion of stable credit. Second, the political will of non-Western nations to trade outside the dollar system strengthens. The pain of petrodollar dependency becomes acute enough to override the inertia of the existing order. Third, and most significantly, the perceived value of assets that are not subject to geographic seizure, political intervention, or currency debasement increases in direct proportion to the perceived instability of the legacy system. This is not speculation. This is arbitrage. The arbitrage between the declining security of industrial age assets and the ascending utility of cyber age assets. And the Iran-US conflict is, in this precise sense, not a threat to the informed investor. It is the catalyst for the most significant wealth migration of the 21st century. The transition from feudalism to industrialism took roughly 100 years. The transition from industrialism to the cyber age is compressing into decades, accelerated by the speed of information, the borderlessness of digital networks, and the absolute mathematical scarcity of new monetary technologies. The window of asymmetric opportunity, the period when legacy assets are visibly failing, but before the majority has priced the new assets accordingly, is not closing slowly, it is closing fast. There is a conversation happening right now in rooms you do not have access to, in private family offices in Geneva and Singapore, in sovereign wealth funds in Abu Dhabi, in quiet advisory sessions between ultra-high net worth individuals and the managers who serve them. That conversation is not about fear. The fear is in the news. The fear is in the retail investors' panicked rebalancing. The fear is performing its function perfectly, keeping the productive middle class anchored to the failing legacy system, while informed capital quietly, methodically, and permanently relocates. Davidson and Rees-Mogg described this dynamic with surgical clarity. The defining characteristic of the transition to the cyber age would be the exit option, the ability of productive, mobile individuals to exit not just one jurisdiction for another, but to exit the entire concept of national jurisdiction. To become sovereign individuals, people whose wealth was so structured, so distributed across encrypted, borderless, unseizable asset classes that no government could effectively tax or confiscate them without their active consent. The exit from the petrodollar system does not require you to be an investment bank. It requires you to understand three fundamental asset categories. First, hard monetary assets that exist outside the banking system. Gold is not a relic. It is the original sovereign asset, the monetary technology that has survived every empire, every currency debasement, every civilizational collapse in 5,000 years. When the petrodollar is stressed, as it is being stressed right now by every exchange of fire in the Persian Gulf, gold performs its ancient function. It migrates towards safety and preserves purchasing power across the transition. Second, Bitcoin, not a replacement for gold but an extension of its logic into the cyber age. Mathematically scarce, cryptographically protected, geographically unconstrained, permanently resistant to seizure by any state actor operating through legitimate legal channels. When Davidson and Rees-Mogg wrote about cybercash, a form of money that would break the state's monopoly on currency, they described its essential properties with remarkable precision, a full decade before Bitcoin existed. It is not coincidence. It is the logic of the transition, working through technology. Third, private productive infrastructure, ownership stakes in logistics, energy generation, and communications outside the publicly traded markets, illiquid by design, inaccessible to retail speculation by design, and for precisely those reasons, structurally insulated from the volatility currently tearing through public markets as this conflict ricochets through global energy prices. The 1% are not afraid of this conflict, they are using it. They are using the fear it generates to acquire cyber-age assets at prices depressed by mass panic. They are using the geopolitical justification it provides to accelerate the decoupling of their wealth from Western and Eastern legacy systems simultaneously. And they are using the monetary instability it unleashes to complete the philosophical and practical act that Davidson and Rees-Mogg called financial apostasy, the deliberate, rational, and irreversible rejection of the state's claim on your productive output. Financial apostasy, the formal renunciation of a faith. The nation-state is not merely a political institution, it is a faith system. It demands belief in its legitimacy, its permanence, its moral authority to extract from you in exchange for protection. It socializes its citizens from birth to accept its premises as natural law rather than historical contingency. And it punishes, with increasing ferocity, those who withdraw their consent. The Iran-US conflict is a moment of revelation. What you are watching is the world's most powerful nation-state spending, the treasury of its middle class, in blood, in debt, in monetary credibility, to defend a monetary monopoly that the financial elite has already, quietly, begun to exit. The smoke over the Strait of Hormuz is the signal. The transition does not care about your political opinions. It does not care whether you are ready. It simply proceeds with mathematical certainty, with historical inevitability. The only question history asks of every person who lives through a civilizational transition is not to need, did you stop it? But did you understand it in time? This is Vested Network. The transition is already underway.